Welcome everybody to another Open Team in-depth session. I'm really pleased to have Philip Sheldrake here to talk about openfarming.net, and I'm particularly excited to prime this conversation because it's been part of our sort of community's ongoing conversation in terms of the limitations of licensing in working through open source licensing and the limitations when we're applying to agriculture and all the nuances. So I'm hoping that this is priming a longer term thread, and excited to have Philip start that conversation and talk about the exciting work that they're doing. With that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Philip, to introduce yourself and your project, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I think a number of anyway. I'm looking forward to a good dialogue here.
Thank you. Exactly my sentiment. It's the dialogue that's really important here because, well, as you'll see, we've got so much together, but it's really an exciting opportunity to be able to present to the goat community here. Because, well, you've got skills and expertise and knowledge that we need, and perhaps we've got some ideas, technology, and know-how that perhaps you need. So this could be a match made in heaven. I don't know, we'll soon find out. So my plan is to do a 60-second personal introduction, because that's not the interesting bit. Then focus on what we're building in terms of the open farming vision. I know for half the time we have together, because the value I think there may be getting your questions, and also the opportunity for me to ask you questions. So that's the way I'd like to shape it. So thanks again for the invitation. It's a privilege to have your time. I'm an engineer of the natural systems, complex adaptive systems type than perhaps the Newtonian 20th century type. I have been working in systems thinking for several years, fascinated with the amalgam of technology and people. So not just technology for technology's sake, but where it gets really interesting when the wonderful things should happen. But as we all know, so often we actually get a train crash instead. So we're trying to see if we can do something special in a primary industry, agriculture. And let's get straight. I've got a few slides just to give you something to look at that's more attractive to me, and just to prompt me as we go through. So let me just share that now. Yeah, hopefully you should be able to see that. Even if I press A, perfect. Good. So you should just see a green screen with Open Farming logo. That's not particularly interesting in itself, but this one slide aims to capture the mission, the purpose of the Open Farming team. We seek to replace monopoly rights under legal code with revenue share under software code. So we're going to explore that, but I'm giving you an overarching view at the moment. If we can do that, then we can open access to innovation knowledge and encourage what we've written it as decentralized cooperation. I would say encourage the sustaining and nurturing of a natural system. If we do that, then that should unlock value for everyone reliant on co-agri-food system. So actually that's a longer way of saying should unlock value for everyone. And make fresh, nutritious and affordable food available to everyone, everywhere, every day, regeneratively, as opposed to causing harm through extraction. So that's the overarching picture, but let me situate why we're coming at this. In 2016, I think it was, at the EAT Forum, there was a paper presented which looked at all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and quite clearly the division into little boxes is entirely artificial. They're all interlinked in their own ways. But food was identified as being at the nexus, more connected into food, and food connected into more of the other goals than any other one. And I've presented that here in terms of the familiar Donut from the Donut Economics book, and highlighted in green font the aspects that we see open farming playing to. So it's quite, everybody on this call probably worked out long before I did. This is a very exciting space to be in, and this it's just wonderful from the environmental perspective, from the societal, cultural perspective, from the nutritional, medicinal perspective. It's just all in the mix. It's very exciting. But this is what we're looking at the start of the third decade of the 21st century. We can learn some lessons from other industries. The first one I've put in here is one with which I have no great knowledge personally, but seems to personify the move to an oligopolistic, centralized phase. There are very few major pharmaceutical firms, and they would argue that's because to bring a drug to market costs gazillions. And we're stuck. Nobody knows how to move to that more natural, open and decentralized structure for that industry. So that's but that's not our problem space today. I'm just putting that up there as an example of something that played out in the 20th century, for which no one that I've stumbled across anyway has an answer in terms of making it more natural, so to speak. Now, the middle industry here, sector, if you like, the internet/web, is one that I've worked in for many years. And like perhaps many on this call, we came to the web when it was decentralized as Tim Berners-Lee envisaged it. We came to the internet as a distributed architecture as the original architects envisaged. And it was an amazing space, and it just blew our minds, and we got all really excited about it. And the turn of the century could only promise amazing things. Well, they were amazing, but just not necessarily perhaps in the way we envisaged, because the interwebs has collapsed down into a few giants in the West and a few giants in the East. And I've been part of a community for several years now that's aiming to re-decentralize the interwebs. One of my focuses known as Web3. There was a Web3, which was the semantic web. Web3 is also now associated with crypto networking, with the application of distributed ledger technologies, such as blockchain, to affect that transition that perhaps, with question marks on either side of it on this slide, may play out in the 2020s, if we get it right. And to the sector in question on this call, agriculture. Well, it's incredibly decentralized at the moment. It's just astonishing that it's survived as it has in such a decentralized fashion for so long. But it's on the cusp of going either centralized, or perhaps if we come together as a community, we might skip that centralizing phase and go directly to locked, open and decentralized. I feel, and I think I can say I know from experience, that it's easier, use that word cautiously, to go directly to locked, open and decentralized than it is to get yourself centralized and then try to re-decentralize. That's the juncture. And I think that we're on this cusp, not because of the concentration of agri-tech over the last few decades, but possibly because of the aggregation of the data associated with agriculture. That is core to the open farming movement, where we would like to see the farmers and agricultural entrepreneurs having domain over, I use the word domain over rather than ownership of, domain over, agency over their collective data, so that they can bring sense making to the data rather than send the data to the sense making. The latter being if you like, the pitch that the likes of, I don't know, Microsoft, IBM might rock up with. If you give us your data, we'll give you back some insights, some intelligence that will be very useful to you. There's and I forget the individual who wrote this and who I read and nicked it from. I will find the reference in the Q&A later. But effectively, as soon as a farmer abdicates sense-making over the data, they become a tenant farmer in that digital sense. This does not bode well for their survival, for the ongoing decentralized cooperative nature of agriculture. So open farming, if you like, exists to provide an alternative to that. Here's a fantastic quote from the IPES. A shift towards diversified and decentralized innovation, locally applicable knowledge, and open access technologies, which they refer to as a new wide tech paradigm, is urgently needed to harness benefits of big data for all. I mean, if I was to point to anything out there that underlined why open farming exists, that would be it. I should have just taken that as our purpose statement, if I'm honest. It's perfect. So we're predicated on one flaw. Intellectual property rights, as we know them today, actually started out in Murano, in the glass industry off the east coast of Italy. They became legalized, bureaucratized in 1624 in English Parliament, which was the Monopoly Rights Act. Now, what's interesting about the Monopoly Rights Act and the legal right of monopoly is that it got a bit of a rebranding at the end of the 20th century. Instead of calling it a monopoly right, we started to call it an intellectual property right. Monopoly has... can you still hear me? I just got a notification that I've been cut off.
I can still hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you.
That must just be my headphones have powered off then. Perfect, sorry about that. So monopoly rights doesn't sound too good in modern parlance because it implies monopoly, whereas free markets are supposed to be about competition rather than somebody having a monopoly. So it's even card-carrying capitalists would contend that they like capitalism, but monopoly capitalism isn't really where it's at. We do like this idea of competition. But that's not what monopoly rights says. Monopoly rights says in order for you to get a return on the investment that you put into an innovation, then you should have monopoly over a certain amount of time to monetize that innovation. So let's just think about that. That means that any innovation that has been created through the investment of resources and is there looking for a return, the only way we have still nearly 400 years later is to insist on having a monopoly, which means insisting on saying the default for this wonderful idea we've had, for this wonderful innovation we've developed, is that no one else can use it. That is business as normal. And that is bonkers in the digital age. To invest so the digital age is personified by changing one system parameter beyond all recognition, and that's friction. It suddenly becomes frictionless in terms of the time and energy it used to take to deal with atoms and traverse space. Copying now is instant and negligible in terms of its cost. And yet we try to apply those digital technologies to support an old-fashioned way to make sure that innovators are appropriately rewarded. Now, monopoly rights / intellectual property rights have been, the weaknesses of it, the downsides have been well known for a century, and many economists have tried to come up with alternatives. So I won't go into those today. Needless to say, you wouldn't read any of them today and think any of them were viable. But we are now in the 2020s, and not only do we have the internet, not only do we have the web, but we have crypto networking, where for the first time we can have an incorruptible, decentralized database. We could have incorruptible centralized databases before, and we could have corruptible decentralized databases. It's only now that we have incorruptible decentralized databases and compute. So surely now we can do something a little bit better for everybody concerned. So open farming can give primacy to the application and development of knowledge and innovation, because we can now create a system that's privacy preserving yet socially meaningful, and ensures the incorruptible and equitable sharing of value recognized at the farm gate. So it's important to explore that in more detail. So let's look at the various players involved. In this little sort of honeycomb diagram here, one thing we're passionate about conveying is that open farming is not a mediator. We just want to get out of the way wherever we possibly can. So the center of this diagram is the open farm. The farmer has farm plan autonomy. The farmer can contribute valuable data, and they can wield valuable knowledge and insight collectively, cooperatively, and they deal directly with their customers as they do today. We just want to make sure that we can help the farmer not just retain, if you like, autonomy in the world of atoms, but we can keep their autonomy in the world of bits and bytes as well. So let me just speak to an example here, because that's easier to talk about than to just talk in abstract terms. Imagine that you're a farmer in Kenya and you're very keen on being careful with your water. Efficient use of water is important to you and your bioregion. Now it happens there's a firm in Israel renowned for their expertise in drip irrigation, and until open farming, that Israeli firm had no other option. They had an idea, they went to investors, the investor says, what's the business model? The business model is intellectual property rights. In other words, we're going to charge royalties up front for anybody who wants to buy this. And the default is that no one else can put this innovation into action unless they come through us and make sure that we get the royalties owned. Now, in the open farming ecosystem, that Israeli firm can license that innovation with the Open Farming License, which is a variation on what the P2P Foundation refer to as a peer license. So peers in the ecosystem can use it, but it puts a legal barrier in the way of anybody wishing to be free riders. Now, the local fabricator in Kenya can take those designs, and if he feels like there's a pent-up demand in Kenya for this particular design, can now offer it for sale. And the Kenyan farmer walks up and says, "I'd like one of those, please." So that's a transaction that's local. That's local fabricators of global innovation selling to local farmers. Of course, everybody on this call will know that digital farming involves hardware, it involves an operating system, and it involves information services. And just like in the mobile phone ecosystem, if you take the information services away, then everybody gets less value, right? The information services are imperative to the successful application of that innovation. Interestingly, the only choice a farmer has at the moment is to, especially if they're looking to derive sense from data beyond their own farm, And that's important because data needs to, if you like, breathe with other data for it to become insightful information, and information needs to breathe alongside other information for it to crystallize knowledge, right? So this is an essential mechanism to any farmer wishing to remain competitive in the 21st century. So rather than have to go and buy such a service from a proprietary state shareholder-centric corporation and abdicate autonomy over the data, open farming exists for that data to be pooled in a cooperative in which the farmer that's participating owns a cooperative share. So this plays to the centuries-old knowledge sharing that permeates the agricultural culture. In order to make the Israeli firm, however, feel happy to license their innovation, we need to give them some guarantee that they will get, as you can see here in the top hexagon in this beehive, we need to encourage them that they will get rewarded with a revenue share, that they perhaps will get faster adoption than they might otherwise have done with the traditional system. And they'll also have the opportunity for real-time learning without having to replicate the data ecosystem themselves or subscribe to some Californian firm's offering. The only way we can offer them incorruptible revenue share from the farm in Kenya is for us to have incorruptible knowledge of the revenue at the farm gate of the farm in Kenya. But because the Kenyan farmer is putting that drip irrigation into use and joining the cooperative and sharing in the data, we actually do have a fairly good understanding of not just what that farmer is growing generally, but precisely the revenues that drip irrigation system helped create. In putting the innovation into the intellectual commons of open farming, the Israeli firm has said that they've priced it, if you like. Perhaps it's 2.7% of associated revenues. And the farmer can then think, well, I'll go for that one, until perhaps an equivalent system crops up and says, actually, this one's priced at 2.2% of associated revenues. The farmer continues to benefit from the information services from her own cooperative, and so long as they continue to make timely payments for revenue distribution. Now, the Open Farming Cooperative rather, doesn't need to know what that bill is. The system, the distributed system, can calculate what the farmer needs to share this week or this month in terms of revenue share. All we need to know as a cooperative is that the farmer has paid revenue share into the system which then ensures that the revenue is distributed to the innovators in the loop on that particular farm. And again, we can do that. We have all the technology to affect that right now. Penalty being, should the farmer decide to perhaps cheat or try to cheat the system, is that the information services are disconnected for as long as that debt is overdue. And without the information services, the farmer becomes less and less competitive. It's just, it doesn't make sense. Everyone's a win-win participating in the system, and we've done everything we can to make sure that the system doesn't reward anyone doing the wrong thing. Bad actors will soon find themselves in a worse position than they would have been if they continued to play the game, so to speak. So this means that we have a situation where we can look at a quadrant, and on the left column we have traditional proprietary approaches. Intellectual property, IP being the name of the game. This phrase is so common, so widespread, that when we're talking to people about open farming. Some people can't even conceive of a world without IP. It's astonishing how concrete this is in people's minds. But it is just a human construct that didn't really exist 400 years ago and will soon not exist again. On the right-hand side, we have open, which means that at the minimum we have a peer license for those participating in the ecosystem until the ecosystem is of such a size that we can transition from peer to purely open license. And on the y-axis, we have underfunded and less viable, and at the top, well-funded and viable. So there'll be a few on this call who are familiar with the bottom right quadrant. Many wonderful open projects. Can anyone find the sustainable financing for it? Can they find anything close to 1% of the free cash flow of the proprietary competitors? If you can, you're lucky. So this quadrant needs some love. Of course, top left is incredibly well known, traditional IP-based business, personified in this sector by perhaps John Deere and their reluctance to give the farmer any domain over the code. And of course, we've also got bottom left, where we have lots of IP out there. It's considered IP because it's not open sourced, but it's not yet commercialized. And it's not open source because no one can see why they should bother. And it's not commercialized because the processes of commercializing it through IP are quite costly. So it means involving raising money and dealing with patent lawyers and starting a business and branding. And so that stuff's stuck there frustrated. And we would contend that all of these, particularly the bottom row, will move towards the open farming ecosystem, and the traditional IP-based business will transition as and when they can see that it's working and that it just makes more business sense. We are very interested in behavioral mechanism design. We know that people don't tend to change their behavior unless we create a system which makes sense for them to do so. But I'll come back to how we get this ball rolling in a moment. Here's the transition. This is, if you like, that aspect of behavioral mechanism design. We start at the top left in a situation that's very linear, very extractive, based on intellectual property. And we at Open Farming, and I'm guessing everybody on this call is very interested in getting to a circular economy, generative, based around the intellectual commons. And the circle top left indicates kind of where we are. It's half green, indicating that agriculture is pretty well decentralized at the moment, but it's half black because it's kind of in an extractive phase, it's linear, and it's based on intellectual property. And we see, you remember that earlier diagram where I showed you where you can go to oligopolistic and centralized, or try and skip that and go to open, locked open and decentralized? Well, this diagram has roughly the same. The first is the arrow going down towards monopoly capitalism. And of course, there's the completely green circle to the right, which is remaining decentralized, but also being regenerative. I won't read the text there verbatim, but effectively, we're trying to make sure that at each stage, there is no monophase transformation here. There's no zero to hero opportunity. But there is a series of phases where we can bring everybody with us. One of the main challenges is, let me just stay on this slide for a moment longer. One of the main challenges is everybody can think about a blue sky system. Everybody can say, wouldn't it be wonderful if, phrases that start with, in a parallel universe. And these kind of phrases have always, from a personal perspective, just absorbed me, because it's not so much painting a picture of what could be, it's planning the transition. The getting us from A to B is really important. And in this instance, we know, if you want to look at it cybernetically, if you like, that any system in equilibrium, as we find today, needs energy into the system to shock it, to move it into a new equilibrium. Knowing that, we were trying to work out what the energy is, what the shock to the system might be. And we've concluded that in this instance, it would involve a fund to acquire a strategically selected portfolio of intellectual property, whether that's IP directly or in fact companies, and then relicense it as intellectual commons. So this fund, if you like, could be, if you want to conceive it like this, an agri-tech venture capital fund, except that instead of the VC portfolio going to market based on intellectual property as it always has done, it's predicated on a different way to secure return on investment. In fact, perhaps a superior way to secure return on investment, not just for the people putting the money into the fund, but for all of the stakeholders involved. To the point where impact investors should be really interested in this fund, because not only is an ROI quite feasible, but it inevitably pursues those SDGs. It pursues the nutritional and social aspects of food that we covered at the top of the stack. So we are already having some really fascinating conversations with some global groups who have access to considerably well-funded organizations to see how we can pull this round together. I haven't yet conceived of a way of doing it without this energy into the system, without showing the way, without having a substantial portfolio of IP relicensed as I see, in order to kickstart the system. But if anyone on this call does have an alternative way of doing it, then we're not going to hang around. We won't wait for that. Just crack on. In the meantime, we're at the point where we are working with our partners, the P2P Foundation, peer-to-peer, which I'm sure at least a good fraction of you will have already come across. A platform cooperativism consortium at the New School in New York, the Open Food Network, which I'm sure, again, no introduction on this call, and Akasha Foundation, which has been started by a co-founder of Ethereum, the world's largest decentralized global compute, in order to focus on this intersection of people and crypto networking. We're working through our partners and trying to attract some new partners in order to raise some seed funding to get us to the point where we can at least outline the strategy in greater detail, but fundamentally be able to tell the story. This is a really cumbersome way of talking about open farming. I can only thank you for your time and attention on this call. It's a rare thing, and you don't often get to rock up to people who can cut large checks and just gas willy-nilly about wouldn't it be nice if sort of vision. So we intend to make, if you like, open farming the movie, where in 25 to 30 minutes we can tell the story about what the world will look like, will feel like, with open farming in it versus the status quo today. Because people, no disrespect to anybody, but people don't tend to be systems thinkers. It hasn't been necessary to our human evolution. But one thing that has been core to our society is storytelling. So we're looking to invest in being able to tell that story. Now, you will have noticed, I'll stop the screen share there and just conclude with this obvious point. I haven't gone through the dozen or so team members in there, but I can tell you right now that none of them have deep agriculture expertise. We have systems thinkers, we have ecologists, we have peer-to-peer experts, cooperative experts, blockchain experts, you name it, but we don't yet have deep agricultural expertise, which is exactly why I reached out to Dawn in the first place. Why Dawn said it would be very useful to that end to come on and present what we're up to at Open Farming in order to see if we can partner with everyone here in order to make this even more of a no-brainer to those seed investors. Waffle on a bit longer, but perhaps it's best if I get some precise questions and then I can see if I can offer succinct answers. How did that come across, Dawn?
That was great, Philip. And again, my hope and expectation is that this is seeding a lot of questions. And I know a lot of the challenges that you've articulated have been discussed across a number of the organizations within Open Team in terms of the next stage of how do we appropriately find this balance to create viable enterprises and large-scale adoption and support the underlying utilities that are necessary. So particularly, that essentially the level of dependency that's necessary to derive the benefit from that site-specific data use, I think is really core to what a lot of us are looking at. And, so I'd like to open it up. I always have lots of questions, but I'd like to open it up to the group here to ask Philip what you may. And it will take people a second to unmute here.
So,
I can.
Go ahead.
We'll jump all at once. There you go. I heard Greg and Ankita there.
You go.
Okay, I will go. Thank you for your talk. I appreciated it very much. It's always exciting to hear visions of what an open farming future can look like. My sticker has blurred my camera, so that's what that is. Regardless, I would love to. I think we've had a little bit of a discussion. I'm actually just going to post a link to this Goat Forum discussion, which is where we started talking a little bit about what some of the challenges that we have from our community with respect to licensing, and trying to think about methods for both distributing things, for making sure that open source economics actually works for agricultural projects. One of the open questions that I have right now is, what are some concrete mechanisms for actually trying to move forward some of these ideas that you've been describing? So maybe even just starting with licensing as an example, right? There are lots of different licensing options available for even us to use in open source agricultural projects. But what do you see as some of the things that we actually need to be able to make it move forward, given the challenges that we have with respect to things like data sharing and making sure that we're, protecting the privacy of our different stakeholders?
There is before I forget, I'm just going to share a YouTube video. Where would you like me to stick that, in the Goat Forum or in the chat here?
Both would be fantastic.
Okay.
But maybe just start with the
easy.
chat.
I can do that. Of course I can.
Fantastic.
YouTube's being a little bit slow here. But it's a video of Vitalik, who invented Ethereum, if you like, alongside my colleague Mihai at the Akasha Foundation. And it's a Web 3 about 6 weeks ago, I think. Yeah, something like that. Visiting the age-old question of how to make. So if you can hear my dog snoring, just let me know. I'll give her a kick. Revisiting this age-old question about how we can possibly make open source software sustainable, so that it doesn't depend on one person finding 2 hours a week in their retirement to keep an essential code base current. I mean, it's ridiculous how many services could be based on that particular open source code, and yet there it is, as fragile as it could possibly be. And it comes down, if it comes down not to price but to value, and that's why we have chosen to go down the peer license route in open farming instead of any of the more well-known open source licenses. I can find the link to peer license explained on the P2P Foundation's wiki, but I'm sure anyone with a search engine here can find that quite quickly. And it's important. The peer license is essential from Ostrom's principles perspective to shut down those free riders, because as soon as you have a free rider, then it becomes pointless for anybody to contribute any money into something for which everyone else can benefit. Interesting thing, about the way in which our society is constructed at the moment is that it's actually a fiduciary duty for directors of for-profit companies to do what's right by their shareholders. And paying to give stuff away doesn't feature. They can't do it. It's fiduciarily impossible for them. So I would personally advocate not adopting an open source license as a viable route forward until you can understand the value it can help contribute and have some incorruptible way to distribute that value. And that's how open farming is predicated, to see if we can solve that conundrum together. There was no arrogance in the word solution. I know I'm not a solutionist. How we can address that challenge together as a community by making sure that that value circulates within the ecosystem based on a peer license rather than an open license. It's tough. It's tough to make open source software work. At the end of the day, I haven't got an alternative answer to that question, as much as I'd like to have a suite to choose from.
Could I ask some sort of like quick pointed questions to make sure I understand kind of the path you're going down? So, there's a lot of discussion about like using smart contracts to kind of drop value down a supply chain, right? So that it's sort of the smart contract defines where that value shows up at the different layers. Is that kind of what you're referring to? Like, I know you're not necessarily don't have a defined solution yet, but is that the kind of rough idea? Like, user buys strawberries, the $3 from the strawberries then goes down the chain in a smart contracted kind of way to everybody who made the strawberry?
Yes, based on the farmer's decision. So the farmer still has autonomy here. We're not trying to do any kind of central planning here. We are trying to, if you like, get what Adam Smith always said we needed, which is for cooperation and competition to work in harmony to each other's strengths. Free marketers seem to have forgotten the bit about cooperation and worshipping competition. We're trying to elevate cooperation to sit alongside competition. So it's co-opetition, some neologism that some people like to use. So yes, we need to be able to make sure that the farmer can can be a custodian of the lands on behalf of everybody, but also serve the closer to home needs of running a viable, sustainable, profitable business. So in terms of understanding the innovator being able to price their innovation as a percentage of the revenues that it helps to that farmer to create is a powerful mechanism, because we're still using the pricing mechanism. There is still a choice that the farmer can make about innovation to go on based on how expensive it is in terms of the revenue share. But we have that information that can then be written into a variety of smart contracts for that automatic peer-to-peer, unmediated distribution, private distribution. In fact, we don't need to. Nobody else needs to see it. The only the innovating firm I mentioned earlier in the example, the Israeli drip irrigation firm. The only people that understand the revenues that come directly to them should be their exchange, assuming they want to convert a common crypto coin to fiat, and their accountants. There's no need for anyone else to have visibility of that.
But is that
all we need to know is that it's being paid? Right.
But in terms of like, so, just like concrete examples are helpful to understand. I think, let's imagine I'm a farmer and I'm using a farm management system like FarmOS. And in this case, for me to use FarmOS, I have to agree to essentially a smart contract that some percentage of my outputs or sales or profits or revenues or whatever is going to be defined is going to go to that. Is it to say that I have a choice in defining that, or is it to say that Mike at FarmOS says, to use my service, you need to pay 1% of your revenues, and you have to sign up for this smart contract? Is it which way? I think those are two different futures. One is more focused on contractual obligation, and the other is more focused on a change in culture so that people are actively, intentionally choosing to support, like kind of the NPR model.
Or the humble bundle model.
Or the Humble Bundle model. Yes, exactly. For the video game enthusiasts.
Because at least that one always helps me at least think about the difference between contributing to the development of a specific thing versus the infrastructure, support, the distribution of the thing. And
Yeah.
So I would answer, please.
Oh, I was just going to say the utility, you've got the underlying utility that we all have to support as well as the applications that run on top of the utility, right?
Exactly that, Dawn. I was about to actually say or suggest that that FARMOS is not a good example because it's the OS, it's the operating system. So a tractor or an irrigation system is a great example. And in this instance, actually, the operating system is something that is available to every farmer in the ecosystem FOC. Right? This is not something we want to charge for per se, but we know that the team developing the operating system needs to be financially viable. So the cooperative will support funding of that operating system. So that is that's almost the standout example because we need hardware, operating system, and the information services. So in this instance, it's membership of the cooperative comes with rights and responsibilities. The right is that collectively we can keep domain, we farmers, agricultural entrepreneurs, can keep domain of our cooperative data and operate better based on that rather than abdicating it to a proprietary shareholder-centric firm. And two models that you just described there, to me, I'm not favouring one over the other. We know that open farming needs to do so much and then stop. We don't want to go further than we need to in order to just change the system, the nature of the system. That will be based on creating the core technology and assembling this portfolio of intellectual commons, previously intellectual property, to kickstart things going. However, I would say that to the two models you just described, it's likely that the one that's most similar to the dominant social norm today is the one that we will lead with. Because what we're trying to do here is bring people with us. We're not trying to say, forget everything you've learned over the last 25 years of being in business, because now we've got this way of doing it. We're trying to say, hey, this way is very similar to what you've understood, and here's the additional benefits. Bringing them on board for a couple of years and then introduce another model. Oh, by the way, you've experienced this for a couple of years. Try this. This is an option. What do you think? And it's for a ground up a collective intelligence to emerge based on which models in which contexts in which bioregions might work better than in other regions. We don't want to decide that, Greg. We want to just get so much, do those two things to get this ball rolling and then see how things emerge, allow the community to shape it for itself.
Would this essentially be sort of an auto version of a more sophisticated freemium model that it could sort of auto implement that sort of the gradation of?
Are you talking about a freemium? By freemium, are you looking specifically in terms of FARMOS and what's colloquially known as the Red Hat model?
Essentially, use that we could be sophisticated in the smart contracts essentially to apply these payments based on use, essentially, which allows for widespread. I'm just trying to use some terms that might bridge with the current.
Yeah, I guess what we're trying to do is to not introduce centralized infrastructure here. We don't want is one major server farm running some VMs, which has the mother of all databases that underpins the eco-agri-food sector.
Yeah.
That is so countercultural that it's not funny. That's what we're actually resisting because. So, for example, I've just helped edit a paper at the United Nations Environmental Programme around using data for cooperation. And some of my co-authors kept referring to establishing the data culture. Everybody needs to get, the data culture is important for them to understand that we can be evidence-oriented. It's evidence-based policy, not policy-based evidence. And it's about this data culture. And I said, there is no one data culture. There can never be one data culture. What we can do is provide the facility for local communities in their social norms, their contexts, their environmental, bioregional characteristics to shape makes sense to them. Because if you try and foist something on it, if you're trying to prescribe to them, then there's going to just be resistance. And that's why 80% of transformation programs fall flat on their arse. So we're trying to be as decentralized as we possibly can.
Go ahead.
It sounds like there's a couple of different pieces that you've described so far. So there's a decentralized data model, which I think we're all interested in various ways. And in a lot of ways, data ends up getting siloed in different people's tools. So that's just one side of things. I'm particularly interested in sort of unpacking a little bit more on this payment side of things, or the way in which the value gets distributed. What do you see as the role of consumers and other data stakeholders or tool stakeholders within this ecosystem?
It's all I will just reiterate is we are standing back. We want to do so much, but not go forward. That's a great question that the community needs to ask and answer collectively. It's not, thank you for asking the question, but if I offered an answer, that would sound, well, who's he to say that? I don't know. Let's work it out together.
Would perhaps it would be helpful for me to then understand how this has been implemented in other contexts to get a better sense for maybe how we as a community can think about how this works in agriculture. What are some other domains in which this concept has worked really well for you guys?
This is another cracking question, if you don't mind saying, because when we first sat down and looked at how we can contribute social good in terms of the SDGs, in terms of this facility to eradicate monopoly rights, we sat down and said, which sector should we do? You'll remember that none of us have a farming background. So we sat down and said, well, which sector should we do it in? Which would be the most important? It's going to be a primary industry probably, and it's going to be the one at the nexus of all the other SDGs. So this is the first. It won't be the last. Once we have open farming up and running, we will look to other industries perhaps that are further towards being centralized before fully centralized, to see if we can head that inevitability off at the pass. But this is it. This is the first attempt, and Kita. On the 400th birthday of the legislation in 2024, we want The Economist to run on their front cover. The agricultural sector, the food sector, is the first to move away from monopoly rights, because monopolies are immoral in the sector.
Hell yeah, brother.
So it would be, I know you mentioned a couple of different papers, and I think you even name dropped Elinor Ostrom, I'm not sure, but at least for me, it would be super helpful to actually get a list of some of the reading materials you've mentioned. I think you mentioned at least 2 different papers that you were
I have a document that's about 24 pages, the last of which is a list of 24 references. So I'd be delighted to email me or Dawn if he already has your email address. It's, as you would imagine, open to share because open's in the name. But I would just caveat, assuming that nobody on the call is from big corporate farming world, that we're kind of just interested in making sure this doesn't necessarily get to the corporate farming, the big ag tech sort of players just yet. We want to remain under their radar, which should be quite easy because we're quite small and embryonic at the moment, but we just don't want Stack going there just yet. But yes, everyone else on the call, yeah, no problem at all. Please, all and every feedback you can possibly give to improve the document. And you look at the team and see that there's no farmers or anyone with agricultural expertise, and you're crying quietly to yourself. Let's just fix that as soon as possible, please.
Well, here, I wanted to throw just before we end the time, and you have a lot of people clearly on your team with experience in intellectual property law and open source strategies and stuff, but just to throw some things out there. So there's a community called GOSH, the Gathering for Open Science Hardware. And within that community, there's been lots of really good discussions about open source in hardware, which is similar in a sense especially in science hardware, similar to sense what you're talking about, where it's taking the core case of open source software, but applying it into a new domain in which some of the core needs are met, and you need to make some fairly heavy modifications, based on this new application. So if you're familiar with like Javier Serrano from CERN just came out with their open source hardware license 2.0. He's awesome, super smart. Their team is super smart. It'd be worth connecting with them if you haven't.
I had the fortune of visiting CERN for a related reason last year and
Nice.
had a major geek out.
Yeah.
So yes, I haven't set license ridiculously, so I need to go and find that.
Yeah,
if
you
you
should
can
check
share
it
a
out.
link, then
Go to openhardware.science or forum.openhardware.science. I believe he recently posted it, and people have started discussing back and forth. There's some pretty hardcore peer-to-peer folks there too, sort of giving some pushback on the license and thoughts, and Javier provides his response there. So good stuff there. And then I would also say, I love everything that you're doing, but to provide some just like provocative thoughts, I think what I found so amazing with an open team, I think specifically, is that by empowering and providing space for developers to talk and be creative and essentially do what they fundamentally want to do in their brains, you can often get to the outcomes that you want without the difficult contractual technical implementations that you're talking about. And I've found that both surprising and awesome within this community, because everybody wants to do this. And so they're willing, once they have personal relationships with other developers and other people in the community, they're willing to take steps that one might not take with a stranger to connect software more deeply, to provide additional access, that kind of stuff. Just a thought.
It's heartening to hear that, and it's just a wonderful thing. Except the time's not on our side.
Yeah.
Because the investments in vertical farming and warehouse farming, Jeff Bezos's investments in Plenty, they just want to corporatize this and effectively do for farming what Amazon has done for retail and cloud computing. It's coming, and it's coming. It's a bit like the exponential we're experiencing with this pandemic at the moment. It'll look like it's quite slow, and then it will arrive very quickly. And quicker than that organic process you've just described there, Greg, as wonderful as it is, and as much as we should sustain that going forward, we can't rely on it.
Well,
in my humble opinion.
I think that's the question about scaling globally and at what pace. And I think part of that is also making some of those ideas and information that are uncommercializable. And you had this in one of the values was the ideas that were left uncommercialized that may actually have a great deal of utility, but are often stranded assets of all sorts of projects, not because they aren't good ideas or might not work, they just didn't work in that situation.
Yep.
And so I think that's where I'd love to come back in terms of the findability in those distributed, searchability and findability, of those stranded assets. I think is a huge task in and of itself, beyond just sort of this licensing project. But I hope that this time has prompted lots of questions, and that Philip, that you'll jump on and we'll create some continued dialogue here. I hope this is not this is the beginning rather than the middle of the conversation. So I look forward to all of you following up and finding more opportunities. As I said, we'll have these hackathons coming up that we'll hope you'll participate in, and have these conversations around the edges and in the middle and so forth. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much.
I hope you'll all join me in thanking Philip for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Talk soon.
Thank you.
Take care.